I'd like to now introduce our host for tonight, Paul Saffo. Paul is a forecaster and an essayist with over 2 decades worth of experience exploring long-term technological change and its impact on business and on society. He advises private and government clients worldwide. He teaches at Stanford. He's a fellow of the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences. He's a Forum Fellow at the World Economic Forum. He serves on several boards, including the Singapore National Research Foundation Science Board and the Long Now Foundation. His essays have appeared in publications from the Harvard Business Review, Foreign Policy, Fortune, Wired, Los Angeles Times, Newsweek, the New York Times, Washington Post. He also writes a column on technology issues for abcnews.com. He has degrees from Harvard, Cambridge, and Stanford University. Paul, welcome.
Thank you, Dave, and you don't realize what a favor you just did for me. Because our guest this evening, John Hennessy, who informed me, says, look, whatever you do, I don't want an introduction. And I said, this is a computer history museum. We must talk about your background. And, well, one doesn't say no to the president of Stanford. So I said, tell you what, I told Dave not to do an introduction of me. So if he doesn't do an introduction of me, I won't do an introduction of you. So thank you for that long introduction. I will now begin. John Hennessy joined Stanford in 1977 as an assistant professor, and if you read his official biography, it's quite sweet. They say in 1986 he became a full professor after, quote, rising through the academic ranks, close quote. I don't know anyone who rose through the ranks like John Hennessy, because the part of the story they didn't tell was in 1981 he pulled together a research team to explore the then exotic notion of RISC, and in 1983 took over the Stanford Computer Systems Lab, which was an early interdisciplinary program, and then in 1984 took a leave, went on a sabbatical, and how many people in this room have taken a sabbatical? Okay. How many of you started a whole industry on your sabbatical? In 1984, he founded MIPS Computer Systems, and of course we'll come back to that in some detail. I just note that by the late 1990s, by the best estimate is that 1 in 3 RISC chips in the business were MIPS based. Vast impact, and also incidentally, I think he may be the only Stanford president who inspired the name of a cartoon character, because the rabbit in the Super Mario 64 was named MIPS after the chip in the system. He did come back to Stanford. He was chair of the CS department from 1994 to 1996. Now, keep in mind that period of time. It was the bubble, and people tended to job hop a little bit, and John had a little trouble holding on to a job. In 96, he became dean of the Stanford School of Engineering, pushed the engineering school deep into its now famous interdisciplinary initiatives. And then in 1999, he was named provost. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with university campuses, a provost is someone who is the chief academic and finance officer. Think about that for a moment. This is like being a mushroom hunter and a bird watcher. You're spending your whole time going like this. You know, absolutely the opposite. It's the hardest job around. It's a job with an illustrious pedigree. Fred Terman held the position for 10 years from 1955. But it's a challenging job. Condoleezza Rice was John's immediate predecessor in the job, and she fled to Washington, D.C. to take on something easier than being provost at Stanford. But as provost, he continued on with the interdisciplinary emphasis, really solidified what he began with engineering as chair of the engineering school. And as they say, no good deed goes unpunished, because in 2000 he became Stanford's 10th president and continued, not surprisingly, with his emphasis on technology transfer and interdisciplinary work. Now, just an aside, for those of us in Silicon Valley, Stanford seems quite large. In fact, Stanford is a very small university. That's why it's called the Leland Stanford Junior University. But seriously, there are only 2,000 faculty, only 14,000 students. That's the size of a dormitory at most Midwestern schools. It's a small entrepreneurial place that keeps pushing into the future. And under John, it has really become a prototyping lab in many ways, not just of technology transfer, but innovations in teaching and in the very future of the academic institution. So John is very much in this job continuing the long tradition of entrepreneurial leaders that Stanford has had, not just people like Fred Terman. Now, along the way, he's picked up a whole bunch of awards. And it's so ridiculously long, I have to read it. I apologize, John. 2000, the IEEE John von Neumann Medal. The same year, the ASCE Benjamin Garber Lamb Award. In 2001, the ACM Eckert Mauchly Award. What two nicer names to have one associated with. 2001, the Seymour Cray Computer Engineering Award. 2004, the NEC CNC Prize. And in 2005, the Founders Award from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering, the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the ACM, and the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers. And the maraschino cherry in this intellectual cocktail, just last fall in 2007, he was given the Computer History Museum Fellows Award. So please join me in welcoming John to the stage.
Which one?
You can sit down.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. That was too long.
I know. I apologize. I would never have done that, but this is the History Museum, and it was Dave's fault. So, this is the History Museum. Let's find out who our audience is. So, okay, who here is an engineer? Good. Easy question. Okay, if I ever should have said, don't raise your hand if you're, and who is on the business side of things these days? Doing business. Still doing engineering. MIPS alums in the room? A couple, good. Anyone in this room who owes your career or personal wealth to MIPS Technologies? Don't be shy, a couple of hands. Good. Okay, well, we have a good sense of the audience. What happened in 1980? There you were, a professor at Stanford, and what happened?
Yeah, well, 1980, I think the late 70s and 1980 were really watershed years for computing. It was a time when there was a lot of change. Xerox had donated the Xerox Altos to Stanford, and that was inspiring a lot of thinking. Out of that thinking, of course, the first thing to come out of it was Sun Microsystems, because I think when we saw that, and Andy Bechtolsheim saw it, and Forrest Baskett saw it, we all envisioned that we could build something that would accomplish much of that function, possibly a lot cheaper than it would have was done then. Of course, the microprocessor was really coming of age at the same time, computer networking, and then DARPA went out and started the VLSI program, which really injected a whole new line of research. Forrest Baskett became the principal investigator for a program at Stanford. The first thing that came out of that was the geometry engine and eventually silicon graphics. And then as we finished that project, we began to think about, well, what should we do next? We need the next idea, the next thing to work on. And we arrived on the idea of beginning work on a processor, I think driven by a perspective that we had a compiler group around, so we knew a lot about the interface between software and hardware. And we had a view that perhaps after all, single chip processors should be designed differently than this long lineage of microprogram machines that had come before and that were being, quite frankly, just cloned progressively into. In fact, I remember, some of you probably remember, Intel and Zilog were locked in this battle for the dominance of the microprocessor industry, and the advertisements would come out. 3 more instructions than the last Intel machine are available on our machine. It will be easier to program it. Well, of course, their programming model was based on an assumption about assembly language. Unix also came of age, and that reset everybody's mind about a standardized operating system, about portability of software, and about the possibility that it might be easier to bring a new processor to market than it had ever been in the past. And all those things, I think, were going through our mind at the same time.
And so you were really swimming against the stream at that time. Maybe, let me jump ahead a little bit to the RISC part, because you mentioned the Zilog add 3 more instructions. So you all have this big idea that maybe more instructions are not a good thing. It's sort of been hanging around for a while. How did that percolate?
You know, it came out of several insights, I think. There was this concept of the semantic gap, and that was the gap between here was the software up here was the hardware down here, and there was a semantic gap between them. And many people had proposed that the solution to that was that the hardware get increasingly complex, so it get closer and closer to the level of the software. I had had some experience working on an early, what became the Microvax 1, seeing how that machine worked, realizing that in that process of moving the hardware up, there was a lot of redundancy, there was a lot of unneeded work that the hardware needed to do to translate these instructions. And from the perspective of somebody who had been working in compilers, because that's where most of my research team was working prior to the start of this, it seemed like a lot of wasted effort. After all, if we could compile the program, we could pay the translation cost once, rather than pay that translation cost every single time an instruction had to be reinterpreted. And that was where we really decided on this direction of reducing the instruction set, simplifying it, let the compiler do as much of the work as possible.
So was this a, don't raise the drawbridge, lower the river kind of moment, or did it happen gradually?
No, it wasn't in the sense that, in fact, I think in retrospect, looking back, here was this counterintuitive result. Simplify the instruction set, the machine runs faster. It was counterintuitive to lots of people. It was counterintuitive to us. One of the problems we had in selling that idea early on was we didn't have a good quantitative explanation of why the concept worked. And it wasn't until several years later when I read a seminal paper from the people at Digital Equipment Corporation that gave us the insight on why the VAX was the way the VAX was. That insight then enabled us to go back and write the seminal paper that now has this equation that we subsequently made the foundation of our book. And it's an interesting thing. It's a reminder of the role of serendipity in research. We really stumbled on something as we went along, and what we stumbled on was the importance of simplifying the instruction set, the resulting improvement in how you could pipeline it and improve the instruction throughput. But we discovered it almost by luck. And that happens all the time in research.
I remember the story of Tom Edison. A woman came up to him and said, "Mr. Edison, you must feel so grateful. You've been so very lucky." And he said, "Well, yes, but it's the damnedest thing. The harder I work, the luckier I seem to get." So, you put together, how big was the original team at Stanford?
Half a dozen people. We started as which we often start projects with, a brainstorming class. So we started a seminar class for graduate students, and we just read papers, proposed ideas, and out of that came the key insights. That probably had 12 people in it. And then the core group was about 6 or 8, doing everything from compilers to doing the chip design to doing a board design for it, et cetera. So it's an academic prototype.
I just had this flash, knowing what the campus is like these days, the idea of reading papers and having discussion, now with the web, all that seems to have disappeared.
I
it's
think
email
it
and
just
instant
goes
messaging.
online. No, but that interactive brainstorming process, maybe someday we'll create a way to do that online that's as good as doing it in person, but we're not close yet. bringing a group of people together, throwing ideas up on the wall, trying different things, that works much better person to person.
Amen. Now, here's what I want to do with questions this evening. We'll have a whole bunch of time for questions at the end, but while we're on this history piece, I know there are some people in this room who know so much more about this subject than me. In fact, I would love to get some questions specifically about the history. I think we have mics in the room, but let me just go a little deeper on this. I mean, the idea wasn't just counterintuitive. You really ticked off a bunch of people.
Oh, absolutely. I still remember Dave Patterson and I were on a panel, and Nick Trudenick was there, and he was sort of the anti-RISC person, having worked on the Micro 370 and various other projects. And I remember Dave made his presentation, and I gave a talk, and then they opened the floor to questions, and somebody asked Trudenick, well, you know, Hennessy has just started this company. If this stuff is all for the birds, what would you advise him to do? And Nick says, well, I'd take the VC's money and move to Brazil. So, but people didn't believe it. It was amazing how, and it's one of the lessons I've learned over time about starting up new things. If you're in the core group, you can see how the glass is actually half full. If you're outside that group, that glass looks half empty, and by the way, there's no water for 200 miles. That's the way people see it. They see this academic prototype unable to scale up to be a real computer, and that's what people wrote. They said, oh, well, when you put virtual memory in, all the advantages will go away. Or when you have to do floating point, all the advantages will go away. And in fact, I mean, this was not a stupid group of Stanford PhD students. These were smart people thinking about this. And in fact, they had thought through many of these issues. But I see that time and time again. When you look at startups, lots of people say, oh, there's nothing there. But the core group sees how to really transform the key idea into something substantial.
So now, as I understand the history, and I don't mean to make you stand so long, Carl, but I'm going to abuse moderator's privilege because I've been dying to ask this question, that it was really that specific thing that since getting rid of interlocking demanded getting rid of a bunch of things that people liked, like multiply and divide, that's what they found particularly offensive.
Well, to get down to a single cycle per instruction, I think, which was, by the way, probably the cornerstone idea.
That's the big idea.
Really was single cycle per instruction, which simplified the entire design. It meant you never had to stop an instruction in the middle, for example, to handle a page fault or some other kind of interrupt. The instruction could always finish. So that was a key insight.
And was that a eureka insight, or did it happen slowly?
No, I think it really came from, you know, we decided the transistor budget would be this, and therefore we would have to simplify, and this was a very logical way to simplify. It also, from the viewpoint of the compiler, made it very easy to think about the compiler. Every instruction takes the same running time, one cycle. And now it's very easy to see what the fastest sequence for doing some particular thing is. It's the thing with the fewest number of instructions. That all made it easy. I think we didn't understand initially the dramatic implications that would have, of course, initially for pipeline machine, but then subsequently for instruction level parallelism and really scaling up the hardware's ability to put instructions through.
Sure, and we're going to get into some of that. It's like this evening I have a substitute watch. My regular one's broken. It was analog and mechanical. And this thing, I'm sure there's a, MIPS technology in it, and I can't figure out the commands. But Carl, tell us who you are for the sake of the video.
My name is Carl Hewitt, and I'm emeritus from MIT. But anyway, the Trudenick story is funny because his job...
Speak a little closer to the mic, Carl.
Trudenick's job was to put the 360, the IBM mainframe, on a chip, and it never came out.
Yeah.
Partly for political reasons.
It was a failure. I mean,
That's
it was
right,
a failure.
That's right.
So
what year was it when all the naysayers turned around and said, oh, yeah, no, I knew all along that would work?
Well, that was a long process. I mean, the funny thing about this is, we were a bunch of academics. We wrote the papers and we figured, okay, our good friends, and we gave presentations at conferences, our friends in industry will now just pick these ideas up and run with them. After all, they're so obviously good ideas. Well, that didn't happen, and it was eventually Gordon Bell who persuaded us that if we didn't set up a separate company to try to take this technology outside of the university, it was going to die on the vine because it was too disruptive to the existing companies. And that was the beginning. It took another 5 years. I'd say by the end of the 80s, there was a landmark paper that eventually got written by the folks at DEC that tried to do a comparison between two implementations and demonstrated that this little microprocessor outperformed this fairly hefty mini computer. And ignoring the hardware costs, which were a big factor, it was a factor of 2 faster. But that took a while to get that out there.
Now, when you went on your leave, did you think you'd go back to Stanford?
Yes. I made the decision early on to at least set the stage that I could go back. So I needed an appropriate title with nobody reporting to me. That's what chief scientists do. And so I took that title and arranged it that nobody reported to me. And that worked well. But I did do, the downside of taking that title is because nobody knows exactly what you do, they feel willing to give you any job that needs to be done. So if you need to go on a cold call with a salesperson, you need to write some debugging code, you need to figure out what's wrong with the compiler, you jump in and do whatever needs to be done.
It's a good plan. Young entrepreneurs take note. Sir, do tell us who you are.
Yes, I'm Todd Besnick, and I'm currently with Align Technology. I was lucky enough to be able to contribute to your textbook, and so I'm very familiar with it. And I came to MIPS one day. This is a quick question. I'll get on to the real one. I came to MIPS one day, and I found out what MIPS really stands for, and I didn't know up until that day. Can you give the audience?
So MIPS was a double entendre. It stood for microprocessor without interlocked pipe stages. And it was always meant to be it's an academic joke, just like RISC was an academic joke. So this is a common thing that academics like to do.
So I thought that was interesting that I was able to get as far in my career without even
So are you
knowing.
going to tell us?
Well,
He just did.
Microprocessor without interlocked pipe
but that was
stages.
the official name.
Well, and MIPS stands for millions of instructions per second. That's why it was a double
I
double
thought there
entendre.
was something
In
funny
fact,
in
we
there.
got in a lawsuit over this because there was a company that started up a thing in Germany called the MIPS magazine. And so the MIPS guys decided they needed to sue them for trademark infringement because it wasn't about MIPS processors. So they sued them. We had to get deposed and all that kinds of thing. And ever since then, I've felt that the only lawyers I like are the ones that are working for me.
So now to the real question. So there are things that made perfect sense at the time in the early 80s when the MIPS ISA was born. The one thing that I can think of is having a branch delay slot. And now, because we've seen the technology change, some of these things become problematic when we try to implement them using all the nifty tricks we know today. I'm wondering if there were things that you found even back in the 80s that you thought, I wish we had done these differently than we did them. And
Yeah, I think certainly by the end of the 80s, we thought branch delay slots were probably a mistake. I think, so there are things like that. We added a bunch of things in the second generation of instructions that we added too much. We should have added less than we did. In retrospect, you do make mistakes like that. The flip side of that is that's an architecture that's now 20 plus years old, which is pretty good by architecture standards, I think. And the only reason I think it survived that is not that we made the mistakes. It's that the architecture was lean enough, even with the mistakes, to be sustainable across multiple decades.
Good. John, I think your mic, if you just slide it up about an inch.
Okay.
I think that'll work.
As long as it doesn't turn the feedback on.
Right. Well, but this is an interactive session. We believe in feedback. Hey, wait, I don't know when I'm going to do it, but
Human-driven feedback.
sometime this evening I'm going to work in the pun risk taker. So if you all see it before me, tell me when to say it. So, did you have, I mean, when did it dawn on you this was going to be a really big thing? In terms of application and impact?
You know, I think that's hard to say. You start to get some interest in it. You can see people using it. I think we could see the explosion. I think the thing that probably really began to convince us is when you saw the explosion of demand for high performance outside of just computers. You saw it happen in video games. You saw it happen in color laser printers. And then you realized that actually you might sell many more processors into that part of the market than you would ever sell into the computer market. And that evolved over time. Certainly when the Nintendo project happened, and by then MIPS was part of Silicon Graphics, that was clear that that was a gigantic market and growing at topsy-turvy size.
Well, I remember John Markoff once told me a story where he was at a fab line watching chips come off, and that there were chips coming off the same fab line for two different destinations. One was a Nintendo and the other was for a supercomputer. And in that moment, he realized that we were in a moment of perfect inversion in the business,
yeah, absolutely,
where the most advanced machines would be at the bottom of the market. And in fact, that number that, you know, a third of all the RISC chips were MIPS chased by the late 90s seems to bear it out. I mean, so this thing is, I mean, obviously we could spend the rest of the evening talking about where the surprises are. But this moment in time, you know, March 2008, some famous baseball philosopher once said, it feels like deja vu all over again. It feels like the industry is at something of a dead end. Is this the same kind of moment as it was?
Well, it's a fork in the road, and you should definitely take it. Since I'm Yogi Berra. The basic concept that instruction level parallelism, that was there. I mean, you look at the very first Stanford MIPS instruction set. It had two instructions packed in a single format, so it really had the possibility to have cycles per instruction less than one. But we followed that roadmap for 20 plus years, 25 years. It wasn't going to last forever. I think the problem was that people were not looking for the end of that road, and so they kept going as if it were going to continue going. And of course, it collapsed. It collapsed because the efficiency of exploiting more instruction level parallelism became so costly in silicon area, and probably most importantly in power, that made that a road that couldn't be followed anymore. So we had to go through transition. The problem we have, Paul, is that we didn't do any of the work necessary to deal with the fact that we now have to go through this transition. So we got to the end of instruction level parallelism. We're going to multi-core as fast as we can. And guess what? The 10 years of research on software, on more detailed architecture work that would learn from that software, that should have been done, wasn't done. And now we've got to live with the fact that we now have machines that we really don't know how to use very well, and go back and do the basic work and try to figure it out.
Well, it saved me a lot of money, because when I got my new Mac Tower, I decided a quad core was enough since nothing ran on the 8.
Yeah.
But now, by coincidence, just today, Intel and Microsoft, just was announced that they gave your pal Dave Patterson $20 million to build a new computing center, the PAR Lab at Berkeley. And the stated goal of that is to accelerate developments in parallel computing. What do you think about that? The right approach? New approach?
No, I think it's a good start. I think it would have been wise had everybody figured out that we needed to do this some time ago. But I think it's a good approach. I think we need to start doing it. And we need the kind of this is not going to be done by any one institution. We're now talking about one of the hardest remaining problems in computer science. Well, there are, of course, lots of new ones we haven't discovered yet. Let me point that out. But this is a very difficult problem to figure out how to use parallelism in a way that's easy, imposes a minimal burden on programmers, and that is efficient. This is a really tough problem. And I think we're going to have Dave and I can think great thoughts, but it's going to be young people that find a solution to this problem, because it's going to take a lot of perseverance to try different things. And we're going to need a community of people working on it in order to make the kind of breakthroughs that are necessary.
Now, I know that you still, I don't know when you managed to do it, but you seem to still spend some time thinking about the future of computer architecture when you're not taking care of Stanford. How soon does radical multi-core really go mainstream in terms of applications and surprises? How many years?
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I'd know exactly how to get there. I think the only way to I think this is really a problem where you're going to have to invent the future in order to figure out what the solution is. I think the hardware is easy to see. I know how to build the hardware. We know how to build multi-core out. We know how to change the architecture. What we really don't know how to do is program it. And the interesting thing, if you look at the RISC insights, they came from a deep understanding of software. We had compilers, we had software. We could say, here's how to build a machine. We could run an experiment. We don't have that for multi-core, because other than say environments where you're doing transaction processing or some effective time-sharing task, where you've got lots of independent tasks and it's easy to see how to use multi-core, we don't know how to use it for other kinds of applications. So now, in the future, think about Word 2015. Right? So Word 2015, forget the typewriter, you talk to it. And by the way, it not only does all the grammar, but it fixes your English. And for people who are older like me, it remembers that word that you can't quite think of, but you know almost what it is.
I'm thinking
the senior moment word.
2015 will be the second term of the Jenna Bush administration.
Yeah, so. That could be. That could be. I thought it was Chelsea, but it could be. In any event, but if you think about that, that's a task that in order to do that, in order to bring all the issues in language recognition, in some kind of natural language processing that you'd like to have there, that's going to require a lot of compute power applied to a particular task. We don't have any idea how to do that.
So is this unfolding in the normal way technologies evolve, or did we screw up in the last 10 years?
We screwed up. We screw up sometimes. We work on the wrong things. I think some people, Carl's been working on parallelism for a long, long time. It's a really hard problem. We should have kept working on it. We had a lot of things going when DARPA funded a big project on it. We should have kept going. We needed to think more about how parallelism was going to affect a community larger than just the high-end supercomputer community, because they're only one piece of that puzzle. We needed to think about the bigger, broader, and the impact on the broader part of computing. And we didn't do it. Well, we make mistakes all the time, and it's time to go back and fix it.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned DARPA, because I wanted to talk a little bit about DARPA under Tony Tether. And there is a perceived, I'm hearing snorts from the audience, I guess to put it politely, a perceived reduction in funding for long-term research in computer science and elsewhere. Bill Wolf, I think it was, at the NAE, he put it very bluntly when he said DARPA is tending to focus merely on reaping the successes of the past and not pushing into the long term. Is that a cheap shot at Tether, or are we really in trouble here?
I think there's a mixed bag here. On the one side, hey, the game changed on 9/11. It really did change, and I think it put Tether and everybody in the Defense Department in a different position than they had traditionally been in. So that I think gets him some opportunity to focus on how I take existing technology and move it into the military space. But I think the real point at where I disagree with some of what's been done is, if you think about DARPA's role in pushing forward technology to the benefit both of the commercial market and the defense market, as was done when Bob Kahn was there, when John Toole was there leading these efforts, that's what really transformed everything. And it transformed not just what was available commercially, But of course, it transformed what was available to the military, because the military is now built not on this completely custom technology, but it's built on commercial technology. It's built on the same things that people are building out there. So you need to have that injection to really push things along. And I think that's where I disagree with this shorter-term strategy that's been pursued.
Though I do note, that inversion phenomena. I was on one of our newer aircraft carriers, and this was about 4 years ago. I walked around and realized the most powerful computer on the carrier was a PlayStation 2 on a crewman's bunk. So they're still catching up. Now, I think it was Wolf, I can't remember who said, the other criticism of DARPA was a shift, that DARPA in the old days funded people, and DARPA today funds programs. And there's a sense that that's a mistake.
Yeah, I think DARPA funded people, and it also funded strategically. So it looked where it thought there was an opportunity. In the late 70s and early 80s, that was in the whole VLSI era as we moved from, prior to that, remember that the only people doing any real substantial design of chips were people who also manufactured them. So this real change of enabling a whole new community, out of which, of course, came the entire fabless semiconductor industry. That's responsible for, at least if raw chip counts, responsible for many more chips out there than the traditional foundry-based semiconductor companies. So that change came out of that. Then they put a push, I think, a long-term push into AI that I think has really, over a longer period, really led to some important contributions, and similarly the breakthrough in parallel computing. And we were making progress in parallel computing, perhaps not as fast as we'd like, and perhaps not as uniformly across the space, but we did make progress in it. And now it's time, I think, to go back and try to look at some of these important long-term problems. Information technology will be critical to the ongoing success of DARPA, and understanding that and the importance of it, I think, remains key.
Absolutely. We have about 10 minutes before I'm going to open this up to questions. So I want to fast forward through a couple of things. The trajectory of your career, you've been a master at technology transfer, bridging the sometimes huge gulf between the academy and industry. And at every stage of your career, you've done new innovations in that space. These days, I'm starting to hear some people say, the line between academia and industry is getting too fuzzy for their taste. What would you say to those people?
Well, too fuzzy. I think what's happened, and this is clearly true, is that industry is often trailing academia by hanging on to the back of a bicycle rider and trying to draft. There is a lot of that goes on. Look at what's happened in industry. Where is the Xerox PARC of today? Where is the Bell Labs of today? Where is the IBM research that existed 20 years ago that could afford to invest in a John Cock for a decade to allow him to play out his ideas? Given what's happened in terms of how companies are run and quarterly reports and a short-term focus on Wall Street, those labs are gone. They're also gone for, I think, another important insight, which is the really fundamental discoveries, the transistor, the personal computer work that Xerox did. They don't become the property of any one company. They become the birthstones of a whole new industry, and the cornerstone of that whole new industry. So it's not clear that those kinds of activities actually belong inside a company, when in fact the results of them and the results of that investment are shared broadly by an industry. So I think universities have to do this today, and that's meant the shift of lots of research activity, even applied research activity, to the universities. So of course there's a close collaboration with industry to try to see which of those ideas is ready to move out into the mainstream.
So, the picture you paint, as I listen behind that, it almost sounds like the universities are becoming the intellectual Noah's Ark, as everybody else abandons the long term, that it's left just to the universities.
I think that is true to a large extent. Now, the danger here becomes that universities pull back from their their long-term fundamental research in order to focus on the more applied shorter-term spectrum. And I think that is a real danger, and one we have to be careful of. The people who do the really long-term work that make the discoveries that underlie the next generation of engineering inventions, they have to continue to do that. Somebody has to be out there thinking about, what do we have past the silicon-based transistor? Because we're going to need that technology, and we might not need it for a decade or 15 years or even 20, but we will need it. Somebody better be thinking about it then. And how do you construct that pipeline of science and discovery and technology? We've got a big group focusing on neuroscience. They're far away from invention, just trying to ask the question of, how does the human brain really work? How do we probe it? How do we understand it? And that eventually, a decade or 2 decades from now, we'll understand enough to begin to leverage that in important ways for helping people around the world.
So now, in the meantime, there's some quite extraordinary things happening globally with universities. Universities are increasingly become borderless, but we're seeing some very impressive commitments to new universities. And, of course, the most dramatic of late is King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia. They didn't exist 2 years ago, and I think they now have the 3rd largest endowment of any university on the planet. Where do they fit? Can they do this? Can they build?
It's a very interesting question. There's a question that's very akin to it. The number one question when we have visitors from outside the U.S. who come to Stanford or come to the Valley, how do I build my version of Silicon Valley in 10 years, please? Tell me that. So I said, well, it took us 40 or 50. Clearly, you have the benefit of hindsight. Maybe you could do it in 20 or 30, but it will take that kind of time. And I think that's how long it takes you can't build a university overnight. If you look at Stanford and its rise to prominence, which really began in the late 50s, so it's really only a 50-year story in terms of the university really rising to world prominence. That's as fast as anybody's ever achieved it. So the question of whether or not you can build these universities faster. On the other hand, you're right. There's a lot of money. There's a long-term commitment. Does location matter? It probably does matter to some extent. Does openness matter? Can you build an institution which is only a technological institution? And is that sustainable in the long term if you don't have other institutions around it? Even in the case, you take a great institution like MIT. It's down the road from Harvard. That's certainly, that whole milieu of institutions in the Boston-Cambridge area benefit from the synergy among them. Can you build a single pinnacle in the middle of where you don't have that opportunity? That's an open question.
And that's a perfect lead to one other area I want to explore, which is Stanford's relationship to Silicon Valley and the future of Silicon Valley. Stanford's role,
I'm very optimistic about the future of the Valley. It's become a hub for incredible technical talent from around the world. Obviously, the universities play a role in attracting many of those people, at least here initially, for graduate school or undergraduate program. But obviously, it's a giant hub. It's a magnet. If you want to do information technology, where do you come? And remember, some of you who are almost as old as I am, some of you will remember when that was on the East Coast, where you went to Boston or Armonk or someplace like that. That talk about a sea change. That was where you went to talk to the great people doing the great work. No more. You come to the West Coast, and that's all in our lifetimes. That's 1975 to now, basically, that occurred over. So I think we've got great educational institutions. We have a great technical base we're building on. We've got houses that cost too much, but we've also got great weather. So there are some things that balance that out. I think we're going to see increasingly diversity in what the Valley does, not only information technology. Green tech, I think, is going to be a very hot area, and a lot of it's going to happen here. I think we're also going to continue to see explosion on the biotech sector. And that's going to be a vibrant thing, perhaps a little north of here mostly, but in this general area. So I'm very optimistic. I think we have a great synergistic relationship between the universities and the Valley. It works well. Both sides of that equation are better because of the presence of the other side. The universities are better because it's much easier to find out what's going on in industry, see what problems they really have, understand them more deeply. And I think industry's better for the presence of the universities.
Good. Let's get some questions here. Tell us who you are.
Oh, okay. My name is George Young. I have no job. Actually, in recent 10 years, I have been working for 17 high-tech jobs, but my employee rate was very low, about 16%, maybe less than 20 months. I came from China 21 years ago. I spent totally 20 years in 6 top universities, studied different majors. In recent 10 years, I worked for 17 companies. My question is about technology innovation. I work on software area. Like database was invented about 40 years ago. Email was about 30 years ago. Web page was invented 15 years ago. In 1993, web page in Mosaic was released to the market. But after web page released, it seems to me technology innovation was suddenly stopped. In recent 10 years, 15 years, I have never seen any significant technology innovation emerging on the market. In recent 10 years, hundreds of billions of VC money invested, but today's NASDAQ is at a level as 10 years ago. I'm a baby boomer, just like 80 million American baby boomers have started retirement now. I believe most people sitting here are baby boomers. In the next 20 years, this 80 million baby boomer will gone, and we already got 20 million illegal immigrants. Every year, more than 1 million come here. It's just very simple.
So let me just take...
My question is, what happened for technology innovation in past 10 years? Okay. And what's your view and your expectation for next 10 years?
So let me restate the question. So that there was and Greg, you can go ahead and give the mic to the next person. So that there were all those innovations, and then something seems to have stalled.
No, I think actually it's simply cyclic. You know, if you haven't been here very long, you don't understand that there are cycles of these things happening. What happened in the Valley between the founding of Hewlett-Packard and the giant explosion of the 80s? There was a lot of research going on. There were a lot of activities. But there were not a lot of companies started. There were a few started. And then there was a giant explosion, right? Sun, Silicon Graphics, Cisco, all these companies founded, right, one on top of the other. And this is the way technology sometimes happens. You make a fundamental investment. It's time to go back and plant some more flowers, nurse them, right? Those flowers are tended by graduate students. They're great tenders of flowers. They grow them strong. They put a lot of brain power into how they grow. And along come the next set of really great ideas. That's how the web came. That's how Yahoo came along. It's how Google came along. It's how the next thing will come along.
And you're so right about the cycles. I remember having breakfast with the CEO at the Good Earth, and he was moving out of town, and he said, the Valley's got too crowded, the houses cost too much, the freeways are too crowded, there's no innovation happening, it's all over, and that was in 1984.
Right. So, he should have kept his house.
Yes. Sir.
Hello, good evening. Mike Brazzoni with Kemp Marketing Consultancy. Mr. Hennessy, to borrow one of Mr. Saffo's lines, looking at the past to prepare for today and to predict the future, what do you feel the impact of allowing market time rather than DARPA time or Intel time to define the prerequisite number of periods through to technology's establishment? For example, if we didn't have Intel time, would have MIPS been a viable NT Windows substitute? That's my first area of inquiry. My second area of inquiry...
Can we just let's deal with your first one, because so just restate it. The sense of Intel time is slower than...
Well, central planning seems to accelerate the speed at which we attempt to bring technologies to market. And it often does not let some of the more capable technologies, it does not allow the time for some more capable technologies to mature in market time.
Yeah.
If MIPS NT under Windows, Windows
okay.
2000 at
It's-
market time wouldn't be here today as a platform substitute.
So the lesson, somebody wrote me a letter today, and they're putting together a book, and they want letters from people who are in interesting positions, and I guess the president of Stanford qualifies. And their question was, what do you wish you knew when you were 25 that you know now? And what I wish is that technology is not enough. That's what I wish I knew then, because it's not enough. It's only part of what really matters. It helps if you're building a company to start with great technology, but it's not enough. You need all the other pieces. You need to figure out how to get to market. You need to find that market. You need to think about, and there were a lot of issues in those early days. You know, when we started MIPS, there were no fabless semiconductor companies. How do you think about building one when there's not even a business model out there for it? So there are a lot of things of that ilk that I think make a difference. And you have to accept that. That's the fact.
So central planning, yay or nay? On
Central planning, nay.
No.
The secondary inquiries
actually,
when you're up. Because
At least not only central.
Pat board seat at the Stanford Universities, can you speak on what the university is doing to instill economic stewardship in the student body, in the academic and adjunct staff, in its integration with the venture capital and investment banking community, and how we can ensure that investments are good investments rather than pure spending? In order to preserve the hardware venture pool, of course.
Okay.
Yeah. Good. Well, of course, we try to. I think lots of people learned a lesson in the bubble of 2000, 2001, and its impact on how you should think about investment. And it was actually, the market got overheated. We had students jumping out with their degree programs unfinished, right? A bunch of those students have come back since then, as you can guess. I think we've learned that lesson now. People are more careful. Now, the industry has changed a lot. And where I think when we started companies 20 years ago, a company with good technology, I could have given you fairly high odds on its success if it had a good management team and things like that. It's harder now. Many good ideas are funded multiple times, and then they're going to slug it out in the marketplace. There may not be enough engineers. There may not be enough executives to have two successful companies, and I think that makes it harder for any one of those companies to be as successful as it might have been in an earlier time.
So I do note, in terms of contributing to the delinquency of minors, there was the mother of a certain high-tech company founder who I know for a fact said when his company went public, Google schmoogle, Sergey needs to get his PhD. But I think we'll have just a... Go ahead.
I asked Jerry Yang's mother about this recently.
Good. I think we'll have just enough time to get through the four folks up here, so let's go dive into the next question.
My name is Jeff Kimball. I work for NetApp. I'd like you to reflect for me a little bit on the relationship or the feedback loop between academia and academic research in particular and industry. You mentioned that we've missed an opportunity, 10 years worth of opportunity in trying to address problems related to multicore. And I confess that it was more than 10 years ago that I was getting Merced first disclosed to me, and I remember going into the meeting in spite of knowing about the work with HP thinking, well, they don't really do this VLIW stuff. They're going to do chip-level MP or symmetric multi-threading or something, and really address the needs of enterprise workloads. And I wonder to what extent that the fact that they didn't choose to do that shut down the academic research that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think lots of things happened. I think industry probably tried to, some of the work they were funding at universities was way too short term. They were trying to solve their next problem, which they could define quite clearly. That was probably the wrong thing to be funding at universities. And they got some interesting results out of it. But it didn't let the universities focus on the really big problem that was out there 10 years out, rather than the problem that they'd had to go over 3 years out. I think the other problem was you could already see the end of the instruction level parallelism train in the mid-1990s. It's just it took everybody a lot longer to accept that it was really there. And I think it's because it's always easier to believe that the route you're on is going to continue to go forward, and I just have to do the next step in it, and it's going to work just fine. And I think that you know, who was the contrarian that said, this is over, and this isn't going to work further? And those contrarians are valuable people, but they often get hammered down in the process of thinking about how projects work and how companies move forward.
My name is Richard Brand. I'm a member of your favorite alumni association and working on technology here in the Valley for a number of years. My question about the university and the stick rate. Are the students staying? And I attended one of David Cheriton's classes on graduate classes on communication and theory, and there's a lot of excitement, a lot of really brilliant people here. My question is, and it goes to some of the issues about economics, are they staying here? Are there any studies to show the retention rate that we're keeping with people in the Valley now versus 10 years back?
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we've certainly looked at that. I think by and large, as you know, Stanford, like virtually every other institution, half of our graduate students in science and technology are from outside the U.S. I think if you go to other institutions, you'd find that number could be as high as 75 or 80%. So I think that does happen. We've been blessed that many of those people have chosen to stay in the Valley and contribute to technology here. But I don't know that that's going to be something that we're permanently guaranteed. And whether or not this country can understand the incredible value that individuals coming from around the world have added to the vibrance of our high-tech industry and get over this issue of limiting H-1B visas and all the related issues there. But in the long term, it will become increasingly attractive to return to the various parts of the world that those people come from. And how the U.S. is going to continue to build vibrance and excellence without the people, because in the end, it really does. That is the fundamental advantage. It's the people. It's the brain power that does it.
Carl Hewitt, alumni of MIT. It's interesting how these things come in waves, because one time, a long time ago, gray hairs like Tony Hoare, Robin Milner, and myself and some others developed this whole theory of concurrency, right? But what did they do? Intel just cranked the frequency on the single processor, and we could never get any traction, right? So then DARPA comes along, and when our time of need is here, then we have a director who has certain silver bullets, and concurrency's not on his list. And so now in terms of explaining this theory to anybody out in industry, there's this big gap, because we don't have the assistant professors, we don't have the associate professors, we don't have the prototypes. All we have is the theory. And there's a big gap between the theory and the application that we now have to leap.
Yeah, I agree, Carl. I think the good news is we've got that theory base that you and many others worked on early on in the early days of parallel computing, the very early days. Now we've got to go back and build a lot of technology and figure out how to make it work. And it's a reminder that the most important things that universities do are those discontinuous inventions, those things that really tilt and change the perspective. They don't lead to just one company. They lead to a whole new realm of companies because they recreate a different direction for an industry and new opportunities. And that's what we really have to preserve in the long term in the universities. Thank you.
Well, one more note. We have this huge gap in terms of producing engineers in this country. And it's been made worse by the undocumented worker thing, which has screwed up the visa process. Is there any way to cure that?
To fix the
gap, our engineering pipeline.
How do we get more engineers?
Oh, our engineering pipeline is hard to fix. I think in the short term we can fix it only by really importing talent. In the long term, I think that problem begins with our K-12 system and how we teach students, the quality of teachers, particularly the quality and preparation of teachers in math and science. And we're going to have to go fix that. We're going to have to go overhaul our entire K-12 system. We're going to have to turn teachers into professionals that are thought of in the same way that professors are thought of.
Yep.
I mean, being a professor is considered a noble profession. So should being a great teacher in our K-12 system. And we have to go back and address that this year.
Zolman Stern, I work for Adobe. I have a question about technological credit, because the question that x86 ultimately won, like CISC won against RISC, came up earlier, which is a vast simplification given that like probably every one of our cell phones uses a RISC architecture. And the question, to put it in concrete terms, is we've seen some many billion-dollar failures in technology, specifically with computer architecture coming into the early 90s. We have the body of knowledge that's, you know, embodied in your textbook, and Intel brings out Itanium. And a more recent technological massive problem, probably to the tune of, you know, $1 to $10 billion, would be Vista, you know, an entire 5-year product development release that I think in the most charitable terms didn't meet expectations.
Hey, but at least it didn't have Clippy.
And
Or Bob.
the question is how do we align the world at large to recognize technological success versus technological failure so we produce better things?
Yeah. Well, I think people can recognize successes in the end. I think what it is a reminder of, remember, what we build now, these things we call computers, whether we're talking about hardware or we're talking about an integrated system of software, these are complicated things. They're the most complicated things we build. And the result is it's very hard to tell how well it's going to work until you actually build it. And I think that's a very difficult problem to overcome. People start with ideas which on paper look great, but when it comes down to the details, things don't work out. I think it's a reminder about how difficult this is, how hard it is to predict the future, and the importance of experimentation. You have to be willing to experiment. And I think it's one of the great things that's happened in computer science. It's become very much an experimental discipline where people try experiments with ideas drawn from key insights about the technology, about theory and the rest of the discipline, and go try experiments. And we're just going to have to try experiments. And a bunch of them are going to fail. And guess what? In universities, if you try that and you fail for good reasons, you still get tenure.
One last question. Having looked over your resume recently, you know, I noticed you've been in your current job for just about longer than you've been in any other job. Are you getting restless, and what's next?
Oh, there's a good question. We'll see. No. Nothing having to do with political office. I can assure you of that. I actually, you know, I'm not restless, but for a kind of interesting reason. Being president of a great university is the most incredible mind-stretching exercise that I've ever encountered. You get to see incredibly brilliant people all the time. You have all these incredible students around you interested in interesting things with, I think, nowadays, a very optimistic view about their ability to go out and make the world a better place. That's inspiring. You can walk around. I can meet with a group from the medical school who's doing groundbreaking work on trying to solve disease. You can meet with a group that's talking about how to promote democracy in Iran. You can go over and look at this great junior faculty member we have who's working on a battery that could increase the density, energy density, by a factor of 10. That's incredible. And guess what? When you're president, you call them up and say, "Can I come over and see that?" They say, "Sure." So I find it's an intriguing job. And what you have to have in this job is you have to find joy and excitement in seeing people do incredible things. And I love it. When one of my colleagues wins an award, when they make a great discovery, I feel just tremendous about it. And that's what makes the job so rewarding.
Fabulous. Perfect. Great.